So, before we begin this, Emma suggests to us that we're required to take out a loan, but through a surprisingly little amount of trial and error, I discovered that we're not actually required to take a loan out in order to complete this scenario. What I assume is happening is that rather than the game tracking whether you took out a loan in the first place and then paid it off, it tracks whether you currently have a loan out on the on the gold achievement of the scenario. So technically not taking out a loan at all fulfills this requirement because you can't have an active loan if you didn't have one in the first place. That being said, there's a little bit of finagling you have to do in order to not go bankrupt before then, but it's simple enough if you kind of figure out different things that you can get rid of and stay afloat until you start earning a lot more. Something I've noticed with the majority of the scenarios so far is that there seems to be this financial threshold where either the zoo hasn't been doing well in the first place or it's coasting by, and then as you do more of the scenario, complete more of the objectives, add more animals, of course this increases the value and therefore means more people want to come in. They start thinking, oh, it should be a bit more expensive because the value is a lot better, so you raise the price up more and more. More people are purchasing things. You begin to hit this threshold where you are beginning to earn a lot more. And if you're just completing the scenarios, this means you're going to rake in cash. I finished these scenarios with like $100,000, $200,000 because in order to complete the scenarios, I am only spending like not even a fraction of that per like habitat that it requires or animal purchase or whatever. It's of course difficult with something like this because the entire layout is already created, which means you're paying taxes on the fact that the buildings exist and all that. So there's already so much of an expense to start off with that you need to have enough in the bank to keep you afloat until you reach that threshold. So that's one of the tasks we have ahead of us is deleting certain things so either it won't be costing you anything or pocketing that money so it can be in the bank so you have it to spend on things you need to supplement the habitat. So with that little introduction out of the way, we're going to start this by naming each of the habitats after the animal that is going to go into it. Some of them have like a pretty obvious thing that they're going for. Some of them it's like not so obvious, but you can kind of tell which animal it's been prepared for. You might need to adjust a little bit, but... And our naming is not going to be in the order which these animals arrive. In fact, the first one I want to go to is a special case. I think the last animal you get for the bronze level is a Nyala. However, what we're going to do is put the Nyala in this habitat and later swap it out for the West African lions. And then in front of it is the Nile Monitors. Then we have a dual habitat for the Indian elephant and Indian rhinoceros. Here is where we'll put the timber wolf. This one's for the Galapagos giant tortoise. Here we have the Chinese pangolin and the Siberian tiger. Then over here is the Bengal tiger. The chimpanzees will go in this one. Here's the red ruffed lemurs. And the red pandas here. And this one is for the Japanese macaques. And with all of those, that leaves us with 4 animals that won't end up having a pre-made habitat. Instead, we will have to make one for them. You can even just if you're bullshitting the end of this, you can just kind of shove them in a habitat, and the game will be like, oh, congratulations, you put them in. But for the sake of this playthrough, I'm gonna do things the honest way. The next thing to note is that there are a lot of little puddles and other water areas that the facilities can't reach to keep them clean. So your options are either to find places to put more facilities or just get rid of the water. And it's just a lot less expensive and more simple to get rid of the water. Especially in the central area, because there just aren't many places you can put a water filter without it disturbing guests. We're gonna start in the West African lion habitat, where we have a little puddle of gross brown water, and then we also have this little pond that's kind of overflowing into what could potentially be a very nice cave, so we might as well lower the water there. Next, we have another small murky puddle in the Indian elephant and rhinoceros habitat, and then we also have an overflow into a potential hard shelter. There's another overflow in this little potential cave area for the timber wolves. And I don't know if it will actually disturb the guests if there is no risk of the murky water hurting an animal, but it looks gross, so you might as well just get rid of the water that's underneath all of these shops. As well as, that one's fine, but might as well get rid of it, and then this murky one right here. And then we move into the chimpanzees, where there's a little one that's hard to see, so don't let that bite you in the butt. Then we have a little potential cave for the red pandas. And for the final body of water, it's honestly really unfortunate because it's adorable that this habitat looks like a hot spring, but it's just too difficult to get clean water in there, so we're gonna get rid of it. And as a bonus, since it would just be really silly to like have floating ripples, you can get a lot of money out of just selling these little effect baubles. And that's how we're gonna start recovering a bit of the cost. Next, we're gonna start deleting a few things without compromising the decorative appeal of the place, and also without compromising efficiency. So the first thing, I'm just gonna delete the gondola that's hovering around in here. You can delete this and it will give you money, but don't delete any of the lily pads or anything because they cost you money. And we're also going to take care of the knocked over gondola over here because it looks kind of trashy. The ones that are actually in the water look fine. The next thing that we can do, signs don't have a use outside of decoration and for you to remember where things are. The guests don't need them. Their pathing just takes them to whatever nearby is available. If they need to use the bathroom, they'll look for a restroom nearby. They don't need the sign to tell them. The restroom itself is what tells them where they're going. So if you don't care to know what's anywhere, you could just delete all the signs. You won't know what every shop is, but it doesn't really matter. You just gotta put vendors down for them. This, of course, only applies to buildings that you can edit. If there's a building you aren't able to edit because it's a game restriction that you can't, then don't bother trying to delete the sign. It's attached. You can't actually do it. I've noticed it seems that all the Meyer zoos have 2 ATM machines next to each other wherever there's an ATM machine, which I suppose is good for if there's a line, but I feel like it kind of says something about his money-grubbing tendencies. And we're not going to have lines for a good while, and even when we do end up having lines, it's not really going to affect like our popularity or anything, so you might as well just delete one. You might as well just delete one of the pairs of ATMs, except for at the entrance where they're not directly next to each other, so it doesn't really matter. Another double we can delete are shops that are just right next to each other. It seems kind of prolific with these Street Fox coffees. There's like 2 locations where there's 2 Street Fox coffees right next to each other. I don't think that's necessary. Not right now anyways. Eventually there'll be long lines there, but for now it's just extra cash out of our pocket that doesn't translate to much more cash in our pocket. You can also just delete shops that don't end up doing very well, like people aren't very attracted to them. I noticed that people wouldn't really line up at this Missy Good, so I just went ahead and deleted it. And while we're focused on these shops, one more little tip I have is don't hire vendors until you see a significant line building up, just like a couple of groups of people waiting for the shop to open. Now these next 2 are going to give us some big money. When you're working with a zoo that requires money, like in the challenge mode, in franchise mode, whatever, it's a good idea to get breeding pairs into your exhibits because they breed fast and often and many. They have like up to like 5 babies at a time. But you have to make sure that you get a good breeding pair. They have good stats. And one of the first times I was doing this scenario, the RNG looked a little troublesome, so I just didn't bother, and I deleted the buildings. And that'll recover a good amount of cost. If you want to find a breeding pair, do so at your own risk, but I can guarantee you pretty well that this scenario will be one without the breeding pairs. I also just went and deleted everything inside the temple because it takes a while for guests to be attracted over there, and they aren't always attracted over there because the only view they can get is of animals napping in their little concrete bed spaces. So just be sure not to delete the plants because those cost you. And then let's delete the little education signs because they don't even have a TV attached to them and they're not going to get too much use anytime soon anyways. There's also a fully completed education sign inside the viewing area for the Timberwolves, which confused me when I first did it because it's kind of like an Asian style, and so I'm like, oh, there must be an Asian animal in here. No, it's just styled for the rest of the zoo. Just delete it anyway. We'll replace everything with just slapping down the TVs and the speakers. Our next step is to remove and replace some unwanted staff facilities. So first off, we're going to go over here and delete the small keeper hut because there's just no habitat gates that are close enough to it to justify putting it there. And instead we're going to put a small staff room because that's just much more usable in this area. Next, there are a couple extra quarantines and vet surgeries. Under normal circumstances, these would help bring up efficiency because animals who are nearby could go to those instead of like the one in the center or near the entrance or whatever. But in this case, we really only need the ones that are nearby the trade center. And even then, we aren't actually going to use those for checking animals who are coming in because Emma said that all the animals are fine, which I take to mean that none of them have injuries or diseases. They were already checked. So I'm just gonna take her word for it and be quick to get them in, so any extra of these buildings aren't necessary. Then we also remove the workshop and research center. You can start doing research later to make your animals more happy and bring in more guests, but it's really not necessary. After that, we replace all the broken water and power facilities because it doesn't cost us any more to buy the second time, and it prevents us from having to spend on labor for the mechanics. One issue is that some of them will willingly become a part of the scenery around it, and some of them, for some reason, have like a different grid going on, so they kind of end up outside of the building if you're not careful. So do with that information what you will. You can have a weird looking power thing outside of the building if you want. And as we go along, we're also going to put down water temperature regulators where there are animals that like hotter weather. So normally after this, you're going to want to replace whatever toilet blocks you can. Some of them are attached to buildings that can't be edited, so you can't delete them. So the mechanics are just going to have to handle them when you put them in. But most of them can be replaced. But for some reason, my game must have glitched or something, because none of the toilet blocks are broken anymore after I came back. Because I saved, exited, came back a second time. So, I guess speedrun strats save and exit and your toilet blocks will be unbroken? I don't know. Weird, but at this stage, if it didn't glitch, you're going to replace the toilets. Anyway, while we're here, do not forget to set a price for your toilets. And your ATMs. At this point, we have way more than enough to replace all the vandalized items, and you can easily fix them by going over to the crime tab and just replace all, replace all, replace all. And now it's time to get most of our hiring done before we finally open up the zoo. Let's start with the people who don't really need a work zone. We got a couple veterinarians, handful of caretakers, maybe a security guard if you feel like it. While we're at it, let's hire a keeper for the next incoming animal, which is the Siberian Tiger. And at this point, don't forget to assign a keeper to the Indian peafowls like I did. And here's the important part. We're going to want a lot of mechanics for upkeep. This time around I started out with 8 mechanics, and I tried to assign them to small areas that included 1 or 2 habitats, a facility or 2. Basically just try to keep things as close together as possible. If you have a mechanic who has things that are far apart, make sure they have less to go to keep things efficient, and to make sure that they don't get overworked. And now that we have mechanics, let's determine maintenance schedules for our facilities and our habitats. I feel like I picked this up from somewhere. I don't remember where, but I like to assign the facilities to be inspected every 9 months. And then I like to set the habitats to be visited by the vets every 9 months and the mechanics every 6 months. And now finally, let's prepare our first habitat, get the game unpaused, and allow the mechanics to start working on the other habitats. And then we'll get to fixing up the Indian peafowl habitat, because I kind of forgot about that. And the next animal to come into our possession is the Nile Monitor, and I forgot about another little section of water we can get rid of. Now we bring in the timber wolves. As you start hiring vendors, you're gonna also want to be placing bins absolutely everywhere you can. Like, wherever you don't see a bin, put one down. Because otherwise you're gonna end up with little piles of garbage every so often, and nobody wants to see that. Next, it's time to prepare this habitat for the Indian rhinoceros. Later on, we'll put the elephants in, but for now it's just going to be a rhino. And as what happens sometimes in a more temperate region, my building session was interrupted by some snow. And I find moments like this perfect for determining if your animals that live in hot regions have enough heaters in their habitat. I know when you place down heaters, they have a range where they operate properly, and they have their temperature labeled, but I find it really difficult to determine what the actual effective space of it is without the contrast of either the snow actually being on the ground and seeing where the heat isn't reaching, or seeing the temperature difference being like blue versus red rather than just like orange versus slightly less orange. And then the final animal going in this round is going to be the Nyala, which of course, as I established earlier, is going into what will eventually be the West African lion habitat.
goodness! You've utterly transformed this place, haven't you? It's just so wonderful to see the animals happily settled back into their habitats. Oh, but there is some bad news, I'm afraid. Our accountants just told me that Mr. Meyer sunk a ton of debt into this zoo before he abandoned it. Unfortunately, that means it's up to us to pay it off. Still, on the bright side, a big batch of animals has just been delivered to the park. So get them settled in and listen. Don't worry too much about the debt.
Before we begin placing more animals, we may as well accomplish an easy goal and just finish off the monorail track. I basically just use autocomplete to get all the pieces linked up together and then open them all up, and we'll see how much profit we end up with. And with that out of the way, we prepare the Western chimpanzee habitat. Another tip I have is to keep your zoo rating going on the up and up consistently. Make sure to put information boards in every little spot where there's heavy traffic and good traffic flow. There's a chance that they'll get caught up in it, there's a chance they won't. The higher density areas you put these boards, the higher the chance somebody's gonna get caught up in the information, and the more education, the higher your zoo rating. You know, so long as everything else is fine. And now we're gonna swap out the Nyala for the West African lions. It's convenient, the heat and stuff is already set. We basically just have to swap out the food. But one other thing we have to do is there's an area where the gate is a little short and there's a tree there, so you really need to make sure to heighten the gate and move the trees. There's another area over here, so I just, because all the trees around this area are native to the region, I just kind of put them inside the habitat, and now they can't be climbed up to escape and thus cause a very serious issue of a lion being outside its habitat rather than inside. Next is the Galapagos tortoise. And now for the Chinese pangolin. And at this point, we can see we've definitely hit that earnings threshold. So from now on, so long as we just deal with the scenario goals, we will be set, we will be earning more and more money. And now we're gonna add in the Bengal Tiger. And you know, wait for that last little bit of a star.
Wow. You've really done us proud by passing that inspection. The World Association of Zoos, Zoological Organizations, and Complementary or Kindred Societies could not be more impressed with your efforts in getting all those animals rehomed so quickly. You know, they actually told me they were considering giving us an award. But hey, I told them not to bother because the work itself was reward enough. Oh, and also, it would have been made out of single-use plastic. Oh, anyone believe what I just heard? That debt I told you about earlier? Just the tip of the iceberg. The accountants have discovered even more holes in the books, and we've got to fill them. Good news, though. Our final batch of animals has been returned to the zoo. Oh, and make sure they're happy for when the reporter arrives. Oh my. I've just received the most amazing news. Lin-Lin, the panda, is going to be loaned to us. Now, the investigators have completely exonerated you. Apparently, they always suspected Mr. Myers was up to something. Anyway, I know this is very last minute, but I don't suppose you could build a suitable habitat for Lin-Lin, could you?
The next task is relatively easy. We basically just take the Indian elephants and put them in the same habitat as the rhinoceri. And then we change the education targets of some of the TVs and audio devices so that the guests will be educated about both species present. Next, we'll bring in the Japanese macaques. The final species we'll be bringing into a pre-made habitat is the red panda. So you don't have to do this to complete the scenario, but for this playthrough, I wanted all the animals out of storage. Originally, I took out the Nyala to bring in the lions because I wanted to save money and space initially, but now we have all the money in the world, so I'm making a Nyala habitat from scratch right next to the lions. So my second to last task in this whole scenario is going to be creating habitats from scratch for the Formosan and Himalayan bears. And now finally, the last thing we have to do is create a nice little sanctuary for Lin-Lin to live out the rest of her days. Because this little old lady deserves a break from being paraded around by Mr. Myers. I think it's a good idea to do this one last because of her age.
You know, I'm still in shock that we have been honored so highly by being loaned Lin-Lin. She's a bit of an international superstar, you know? I hear she's even got a book deal. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that Mr. Myers' attempt to scapegoat you has failed quite thoroughly. Although, that sounds about par for the course given that his zoos are failing left, right, and center. And if they aren't collapsing because of mismanagement, then they're being taken away from him by local authorities. And he's had so many escapes that in one of his zoos, apparently 100% of the animals were fakes. And not even convincing ones. They were mostly paper mache. Ugh! The sooner that awful man is out of this business, the sooner I'll breathe a sigh of relief.
And there you have it. No loans necessary. I hope this tutorial was helpful and not too lengthy, but I want it to be thorough, give extra tips and tricks, stuff like that. A lot of the stuff I said can apply to pretty much all the other scenarios. Especially the thing about the earnings threshold, because that helps you not blow all your money and then go bankrupt midway.